Director for MPower Action Fund, and will serve as moderator for our discussion today. It's really hard to believe that it's been 21 years since the 9/11 attacks, and unfortunately not much has changed in terms of the trauma, post 9/11 discriminatory policies, forever wars, racial profiling, and surveillance that our communities have had to endure. The past 20 plus years, our communities have had to grapple with the rise in anti-Muslim hate crimes and attacks, $8 trillion spent on 9/11 wars by our government, and countless deaths, our forever wars coming home with the rise in police militarization as a result of military equipment flooding our streets and communities through the DoD's 1033 program, and Guantanamo Bay still being open, with 36 Muslim men remaining and detained indefinitely, the vast majority without charge or trial. Our panelists have spent decades organizing in their communities and fighting back against these unconstitutional and discriminatory policies. And at the core of our discussion today, we'll talk about the immense harms, in particular, such as programs such as ShotSpotter and other surveillance technologies are creating in our communities. Many of you likely have never heard of ShotSpotter. This is a surveillance system that was founded in the 1990s. It's operating in more than 100 cities across the country, covers certain neighborhoods, predominantly Black and Latinx communities, with microphones, and claims to distinguish the sound of gunfire from other noises and identify its location. ShotSpotter then sends alerts of the supposed gunfire directly to local police to investigate, and in many localities, it's only deployed in areas with the highest proportion of minorities. There's been multiple studies and analyses that have shown that more than 90% of ShotSpotter alerts lead police to find absolutely zero evidence to corroborate gunfire when police arrive at the location that ShotSpotter sent them. No shooting, no guns recovered, no shell casings, nothing. So imagine a resident who happens to be in the vicinity of a ShotSpotter alert will then serve as a target of police suspicion and arrests. In Chicago, for instance, which is just one of the localities where ShotSpotter is deployed in predominantly Black and Latinx communities, the Chicago PD has a long history of excessive force and discriminatory stop and frisk and other abusive practices, with the Chicago Inspector General issuing a very critical report about ShotSpotter last year. What this program does, and our panelists will delve into further, is exacerbate police bias towards marginalized communities. Movement groups have organized an open letter to ShotSpotter opposing it in their communities, with dozens of organizations joining the effort, including Fight for the Future, Center for Victims of Torture, and Mehente. MPower's petition against ShotSpotter has also garnered more than 10,000 signatures. Our panelists will discuss further how this program impacts the Muslim and other marginalized communities and ways that you can fight back. To get us started, I'm pleased to introduce you to our panelists. Khaled Alexander is the president of Pillars of the Community, an organization that advocates for people negatively impacted by the criminal justice system and is based in San Diego. Sarah Hamid leads the Policing Technology Campaign at the Carceral Tech Resistance Network, a community archive and knowledge sharing network for organizers building community defense against the design, rollout, and experimentation of carceral technologies, and is based in Portland, Oregon. Linda Sarsour is an award-winning racial justice and civil rights activist, community organizer, and is the executive director of MPower Change and is based in New York. I'm going to turn it to our panelists to tell us a little more about themselves, what their organization does, and what led them to get involved in community organizing and advocacy. Khaled, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Thank you for the introduction. Really excited to be here. So, you know, I, like others in San Diego, was born and raised in San Diego. I actually became Muslim in 1995 and went through all of the different kind of obstacles that somebody, you know, being raised by a single mother, African-American, growing up goes through. Becoming Muslim actually gave me an opportunity to travel the world and visit different cultures and see different ways of life and worldviews. Barely graduated high school, eventually ended up going back to school where I got a degree in comparative literature and had an opportunity to live in Syria off and on for 3 years on a Fulbright scholarship. After returning and living in Southeast San Diego, which is a community not unlike other communities throughout the United States that's over-policed and heavily impacted by incarceration, I was pulled over 3 times in a period of 2 weeks. And there were 2 questions that stood out to me that I didn't remember being asked before. One is, am I a fourth waiver, which many people who have spent time in prisons are forced to literally waive their Fourth Amendment right? And am I a gang member? Initially, I thought that those questions were to understand who I was or where I came from, but quickly recognized that really what was happening is a way of kind of othering me and othering people in the community that I was living in. I don't think I would have been able to understand and interpret those things in the same way had I stayed in the United States. And really, it was work like Edward Said that was able to give me an understanding of, hey, whether I'm from a gang, whether I'm not from a gang, what does that have to do with me being pulled over? Fast forward a few years, we started Pillars of the Community as a Muslim organization kind of dedicated to serving the communities that we lived in and were a part of. And connecting it and essentially trying to be an asset to the communities that we lived in, and be seen kind of as a force for good. And I have a lot more to say, but I'm not going to say it. I'm going to pass it on. I'm trying to be good today.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over now to Sarah Hamid.
Salam, everybody. It's such a treat to be here. I don't get to have in-community conversations a lot, so I'm really, really grateful for this space and to be learning from y'all today. So I'm going to first spend a little bit of time introducing the network and speaking a little bit about the work and the tactics that we like to invest in. CTRN is a coalition of organizers campaigning against the design, experimentation, and rollout of technologies by prisons, border enforcement, police, and commercial partnerships. Our group is primarily made up of femme, Black, immigrant, and non-Black POC organizers, most of whom are systems impacted and some of whom are incarcerated. My own work is primarily embedded in Portland, Oregon, but CTRN has organizers in most West Coast US states. Sorry, I have to go by a script. I can't be as cool as Khaled, so I'm just gonna do my best and try and pull it off. Okay, so CTRN positions itself as an abolitionist organization. And I want to pause here because this is a concept that I think deserves a lot of unpacking. It's been, bandied about a lot, especially after the police homicide of George Floyd and the subsequent uprising. And I also think that it's an important conversation to have with the Muslim community. So CTRN organizers are US based, and we position our work toward the eradication of the institution of enclosure and punishment that's grew up alongside the United States, right? So that's a system that in this context has evolved alongside a parallel history of genocide, enslavement, racial apartheid, racialized eugenics, and imperialism. So that means that our justice system in the so-called United States reflects this particular history, and the disparate impact of US police and prison system is not an accidental byproduct. It's the operating fact of an institution that was built on identifying, criminalizing, enclosing, and punishing communities who are targeted by a state that for the majority of its history was an explicitly white supremacist state and now operates through de facto white supremacist practices. So CTRN organizers position ourselves against that system. And that's a very specific system. Oftentimes people say things like, oh, you're against safety because you're against police and you're against, community, or you're in favor of community members being harmed and things like that. But I think it's really important to distinguish between what exactly it is the target of our campaigns. So our work is against the systems and the technologies that are invested in these systems. And carceral technologies, as we understand it, are bound up in the control, coercion, capture, and exile of entire categories of people. Just like you mentioned, Yasmine, after 9/11, that's the scope and scale of how that targeting affected the Muslim community changed dramatically. These tech and the tech industries and the state actors that scaffold their use are the inheritance, like I said, of a long history of racialized surveillance. And that entire system was trained on the Muslim community, many of whom hadn't been either aware of how this system was affecting other communities, including Muslims in the United States, or many of whom had the privilege of not experiencing that kind of targeted surveillance for a very, very long time. So it was a moment of extreme trauma for our community. But this is a long, ongoing system that was trained towards our community, which means that there have been other communities before us and other Muslim communities who have built up longstanding tactics of struggle and resistance. And that's the kind of work that CTRN embeds ourselves in. So for instance, the kind of work that we do is we organize things like coalitions with tech workers, coalitions at schools, trying to affect the pipeline of production for these violent technologies, many of which eventually find commercial use back home in contexts where they affect our families. We also target vendors, we enact consumer-facing campaigns, and we target shareholders. But primarily our work brings us in contact with local government a lot and city councils, and where we do things like watch procurements, and we make sure that the kinds of investments that our city officials are doing with our state dollars reflect the values that we as Muslims and we as abolitionists and we as organizers would like them to reflect. So that's a little bit of taste of our work, and I'm really excited to jump into it further in this conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. And I'm going to turn it over now to Linda Sarsour.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This is actually a great crowd on a Friday afternoon, at least in East Coast time, to have people that are interested in surveillance, because I think Khaled said this earlier in our kind of, practice session, how not many people actually know what is happening, what our government is using to surveil our communities. And it's important for us to be as well informed as possible. I am the executive director of MPower Change, that is honored to be hosting this conversation today. And I'm one of those folks that didn't, grow up as a kid being like, when I grow up, I want to be an activist. That was just not who I was. It's not what I dreamed about. But here I am. The horrific attacks of 9/11 happened in my city, killed my fellow New Yorkers. And it was a really traumatic experience. And I was a college student. And I thought I was just going to be like everybody else. And I was just going to mourn these people that were taken from us and taken from their families. And it turned out that our Muslim community, the community that I was from, not only had to mourn our fellow New Yorkers, we had to start mourning people in our own community, people who were being detained and deported, people who were being raided by every level of law enforcement that you can imagine possible, even ones that I had never heard of. I come from one of the largest Muslim American communities here in the New York State area, really on the East Coast, and the things that I witnessed. And I knew that America was founded on injustice, and I knew that there was racial profiling of Black and brown people. I understood injustice just from being and growing up in communities of color, but I had never interfaced with it at such a close range. Just on Fifth Avenue, where my community lives, in this main street, watching a law enforcement agency, Black unidentified cars just coming in and raiding coffee shops, having men come out of buildings, lay down on the street as they, raided their apartments and homes, and really for nothing more than them just being affiliated with the faith of these 9/11 terrorists. And so for me, that was the moment that radicalized me. And really having this conversation, while I know that many hundreds of families across the country will be mourning their family members 21 years later, we as Muslim communities also get triggered by the anniversary of 9/11. It's a reminder of the policies. It reminds us that our country decided that instead of bringing people together, they decided that Muslims within America were the enemy. And they proved that to us over and over again with different policies. And we'll talk a little bit later about what that actually specifically looked like in New York, where I'm from, and more specifically how it targeted me and my organization, and even the work that we do to try to build solidarity, to provide service to immigrants, refugees, and other people of color and low-income communities. So I'm just honored to be here to talk about ShotSpotter just as one example of what the government is capable of, and not only what the government is capable of, but what the corporations are capable of, because there are people who make money off of the profiling, off of the silencing, intimidation, and criminalization of our communities. And that is the thing that makes this even more outrageous, that it's not just a government run, it's actually profit run. So the more people who are terrorized, the more surveillance that is in our community, the more somebody makes money off of this. So I'm just really happy to be here and happy to have this important conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Linda, Khaled, and Sarah, for the invaluable work that you're doing in your communities. I want to now turn it over to you to see if you can talk a little bit more about this program. If you can discuss how you've been organizing and fighting back ShotSpotter and other surveillance tools and programs in your community.
Yeah, I can start. So although I've been born and raised in the United States, although I was aware of programs like COINTELPRO, et cetera, none of these things really came home to me until 33 African-American men were rounded up in Southeast San Diego. Some of them they were from Southeast San Diego, but some of them weren't even living in the state of California at the time. And were charged with 50 years to life, bail set at over $1 million. And when in court, the district attorney said, we don't think they committed a crime. We don't even think that they knew about some alleged crimes. But because they were a part of a gang database, because they had been documented as gang members, they can be charged with any alleged crime that had been committed by an alleged gang. And because they were allegedly from this, they can be charged with said crimes. The biggest kind of shock to me was most of the people, as usual, took plea deals. Two of them, Aaron Harvey and Brandon Tiny Dude Duncan, who fought those charges, after they were released, the push was to tell them, hey, just say you weren't gang, that you're not a part of a gang. Say that your documentation itself is what was incorrect. And when they would go to different events, people would always ask them, not that you commit a crime, but are you actually a gang member? And so all of a sudden, this connection between Muslims who've been labeled as terrorists, Muslims who come from terrorist countries, et cetera, being connected and being able to see that play out in my own community, in the African-American community, without trial, without any type of thing, kind of brought all of those things home to me. So we've been doing a lot of work around gang documentation for years. When a friend of mine who was then leading the CARE organization, Dustin Crown, he said, hey, you know what, there's these smart streetlights that are popping up in San Diego that you might want to pay attention to. And I had assumed that I had heard about these streetlights, but assumed that, larger organizations, larger civil rights organizations were really paying attention to them. So I began to ask around. I spoke to a council member staff and I said, hey, what do you know about it? And the council members themselves didn't know anything about it. I showed up to a community event that was supposed to be getting community feedback about these smart streetlights. I was the only person that was there. Nobody else in the community even knew about the event. And come to find out that there were 3,000 smart streetlights, which were already up and and operating throughout San Diego, which not only recorded audio, but also recorded video and metadata. So that was my entry point into recognizing, hey, there's technologies that are being used to criminalize folks, and there's technologies out there that can be used to criminalize folks that we need to be paying attention to. Long story short, because of how shocking that meeting was, it was obvious to me that these streetlights, these surveillance technologies, which were only being used by the police, but had been passed off to taxpayers as like energy saving lights, that nobody knew what was happening, really touched on so many different communities, whether it was advocates that were advocating for homelessness, whether it was people who were worried about immigration and how immigration policies were unfairly, criminalizing people of color in this country, whether it was people like myself who were interested in how this would impact gang documentation. And so I started reaching out to organizations and individuals I knew who cared about these issues. We were able to create a large grassroots movement called the Trust Coalition, led by the Trust Coalition, that then created an ordinance that would begin to look at, hey, not only are these smart streetlights problematic, but there are other technologies which are surveilling our communities that we should be paying attention to. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, that we're going to continue to be targeted at it. So we need to have some type of measures in place to safeguard, and at the very least to make sure that council members and community know the type of technologies that are happening. This is a 3-4 year fight that happened with a large group of community from a lot of different sectors. And eventually, because of this, ShotSpotter technology fell under some of the things that we were fighting for. And although the city attorney and some politicians and law enforcement were trying to prevent these things from being able to be passed, we were able to leverage the fight for this ordinance in order to cancel the ShotSpotter contract in our community, which is, ShotSpotter had been planted and was operational in about a 4-mile radius of the community that I'm a part of and that I live in. And I believe they were spending something like, the city was spending something like $600,000 for that contract. So that's how we got involved in it. Long story short, long community, a lot of hard effort. We have a couple of ordinances that did pass. One creates community oversight and the other one kind of establishes what falls under those community oversights. The ShotSpotter contract was canceled. The smart streetlights were canceled. The next fight is going to be continuing to make sure that those things stay off and aren't used to target our communities. Don't leave too much silence for me. Don't leave, because I'll keep going. I've got notes. I've got notes, Sarah. I'm ready.
That was a beautiful introduction to the technology and surveillance landscape in general. I think I want to speak a little bit specifically about what's happening in Portland, because we're one of the the fronts right now, because there's a ongoing attempt by the company to secure a contract in Portland, and it has a bit of a shorter history. So the conversation around ShotSpotter actually began in 2020, because one of the only wins that the 100+ days of protests against racialized police homicide was able to achieve in the city of Portland was the dissolution of the gun violence task force, which was in effect just like a racist stop and frisk program, which was harassing Black and Indigenous Portlanders. And immediately, like without skipping a beat, immediately the Portland police started launching an aggressive media campaign claiming that there was a gun violence crisis in Portland. And this was even before they had so-called crime statistics available to them, right? This was their reaction to supposedly defunding the police. And so in the midst of a pandemic where there was an ongoing housing crisis, where there was an ongoing eviction crisis, where there was an ongoing food crisis, multiple crises, the city started honing itself to this narrative that there's a ongoing gun violence crisis in Portland. And that's what they wanted to focus on. So within 2 years, we saw that city officials were given a proposal to procure a ShotSpotter because they'd been in conversation with vendors, they've been in conversations with other police chiefs, they've been in conversations with the tech industry to try and find a way to address this problem or this crisis. And it's kind of a learning moment too, because we're starting to realize that these kind of like technology and crime clusters are really convenient for politicians who tend to be inept when it comes to solving things like housing crises, right? Which are like the real things that are affecting their communities. But what they love to do is make up like safety crises and then solve them with technologies. And they do this because it makes it look like they're able to do something. These are the levers of policy that they're able to pull, right, very, very easily. And so right now we have like a broad-based united front against bringing ShotSpotter into our community, because one of the justifications for this technology is that it's going to allow the police to get intelligence in spaces where communities don't speak to the police. There is absolutely no reflection here as to why that's the case, why there are communities that have less trust. Instead, the solution is to install surveillance devices within these communities to procure intelligence. And as a diasporic kid, like this has extreme resonances and explains why there's such a crossover between the kinds of technologies that were developed and honed in war contexts, where also people didn't speak to the police or colonizing forces, right? And what we're seeing now. And what this narrative is effectively admitting is what the police do is they deploy violence, and it's up to the city council to decide where that violence is going to be deployed. And they're going to use technology to give them a scientific veneer to deploy that violence. And so I'm really activated and excited and super hopeful by the coalition that's come together in Portland and is willing to stand up against this because like we always say, and, like Tawana Petty just absolutely like iconically said for us, surveillance isn't safety, right?
I'm just going to jump in here real quick, Yasmine, because I saw somebody asked something. ShotSpotter is really, and I'm glad for me, this is like a first conversation of many. ShotSpotter is basically for people who are not, haven't done work to counter surveillance or against surveillance, or are not in kind of law enforcement accountability work or abolition work. ShotSpotter is really a violation of your privacy. ShotSpotter is audio surveillance, and it's mostly in communities and Black and brown and immigrant communities. what it's supposed to do, it's supposed to pick up what they believe to be gunshots. And the idea here is it's supposed to be a quote unquote solution for gun violence, except that ShotSpotter is still computerized. So it picks up, for example, engine sounds, it picks up fireworks, it picks up other sounds that could be, jackhammers, right? So it's not actually even accurate in its mission of what it's even supposed to do. And remember that because of the type of a system that ShotSpotter is, what it does is it calls the cops when the cops are not called. So it's not like there's really some mass shooting and then all of a sudden the cops come to save the people. They're listening to the surveillance. They're not exactly sure what the surveillance is. They come into the communities, and then now it's time to figure out where the sound is coming from, which then leads to potential hostile interactions with people in the community. And I'll tie it back to a story that some of you may have heard about, and it happened last year in 2021, which was about 13-year-old Adam Toledo, who was a young boy in Chicago, who, because of ShotSpotter and the ways in which ShotSpotter kind of indicated to some law enforcement people sitting somewhere listening to ShotSpotters that there were some gunshots somewhere, even though Adam Toledo did not have a gun, but because of the way that interaction happened and the time of night that it was, Adam Toledo lost his life. So what we're talking about here is very serious. Not only is it a violation of your civil liberties and privacy, that ShotSpotter to me shouldn't exist just for that reason. It's also dangerous in the sense that it's not even accurate, and it allows law enforcement to basically terrorize our communities without really having actual accurate information. It's not like they're watching a screen where they see a guy running around with a gun. They hear things. I mean, sometimes in New York, I'm in New York City. I don't know about people that live in, in Brooklyn, or if you live in Oakland, I don't know, I hear things that could be gunshots all the time. But in fact, it might be just kids in the community doing some fireworks, which would mean that law enforcement would descend upon our community. So I just wanted to make that point about ShotSpotter and why it's important for us to know what it is, because that's the thing that law enforcement leverages. It leverages that ordinary people that are living in communities don't even know. Sometimes you pass a camera that's on your light post and you don't even know why it's there. You might think it's the camera to catch you speeding, but in fact, that is not what the purpose of it is. And we know this from watching and looking at exposés from the New York Police Department, that a lot of the cameras that you see around New York City are not to catch you speeding. They are actual surveillance cameras that are pointing at mosques, pointing at particular areas that are where certain communities are congregating or people are congregating. So I just wanted to say to folks that hopefully this is your first introduction to ShotSpotter, and hopefully you continue to go back into your communities, figure out, is your city one of the cities with ShotSpotter? Where are these ShotSpotters? Can you show up to a city council meeting and be like, I never heard of this? Go to your city. Sometimes your city council member could be the biggest, nicest progressive possible, and they didn't even tell you that there was ShotSpotter in your community. And guess what? They might not even have known that because they might have been there before they got there. But this is a really great organizing opportunity for us to really go back and figure out, like, does this exist? And what am I going to do about it?
Can I add a little bit, Yasmine? Kind of an exclamation point to what Sister Sarah and Linda are saying. That I think both of them stress two important points. What is ShotSpotter technology? Really, it's based on an idea of, one, of fear, and two, that you can't trust the community itself to report any type of violence that's happening within it. I've never met anybody or heard about any shootings that took place that people didn't call the police. When somebody gets shot, you call the police. I'm an abolitionist. I hate the police. If I see somebody get shot, I'm calling 911 because I'm hoping that along with the police, an ambulance is going to come and be able to help that person. What ShotSpotter says is something like 80% or 90% of gunshots go unreported. There's nothing illegal in this country about shooting a gun. There's nothing illegal about having loud noises. But what that does is to Sister Linda's point, is it then gives the police an excuse to come into communities. They know that these things have not, that if somebody gets shot, that they'll get called, but it gives them an excuse to come into to communities hyper vigilant. So when they're asking me, am I a gang member? When they're asking me, am I a fourth waiver? What they're asking me is, what they're really trying to find out is, how many of my rights can they get away with violating? Because they can then say, he was a gang member, he had tattoos, she was a fourth waiver, et cetera, et cetera. and then be able to beat you up, to be able to shoot you, as they did with Adam Toledo, et cetera, et cetera. So one, even if this technology did work, which it doesn't, their percentages and their the way that they describe what their technology itself does is just respond to loud noises. And so it's a waste of taxpayer money. It's another excuse for police to come in and brutalize us. One can only imagine, a'udhu billah, if there was another 9/11 situation where, again, they begin to hyper-target Muslims as extremists and as terrorists, blah, blah, blah. What would they do to our mosque if there's a loud noise outside of that mosque? If they think that they hear things, how will they use these technologies to be able to attack us? The other thing, and I think Sarsour can probably speak about this also, a lot of these technologies, just because they're recording sounds right now, doesn't mean that you can't, like an app, update it to do other types of surveillance. As we found with our smart streetlights, they were tracking how many people walk by, when do they walk by, essentially teaching how many cats come by. They said that they can smell a fire before it actually happened, and said that data is the new bacon. So how are these technologies being used now is important, but also how can they be used in the future, I think, is a really important question that we all need to be challenging our council members to be paying attention to. Y'all got me excited, fired up.
Thank you so much, Khaled, Linda, and Sarah. So the last question I wanted to ask before we open it up to Q&A for our attendees. I mean, we had about 200 folks that registered for this webinar. We've had thousands of MPower members take action opposing ShotSpotter. What sort of recommendations or calls to action do you have for folks on this webinar right now that, you know, for them to raise more awareness and alarms about this program and ways to push back against it in their own communities?
I feel shy speaking now since I just spoke out of turn.
Go ahead, Khaled.
All right, I'll do it. If you ask me, I'm going to do it every time. So one, I think, is attending forums like this and just being aware of what's happening, I think, is extremely important. I also think it's important to connect yourself to people who understand these technologies and what their capabilities are. We would not have been able to do what we did in San Diego had we not had connections to groups, for example, called the Tech Workers Coalition, who understand how this technology speaks. I don't understand technology. I don't like technology. If I could do away with Zoom and cell phones and just, you know, live life in the desert, I probably, well, I'm saying that now as I have, you know, a fan and everything like that. But anyways, I don't understand it. So know people who understand technologies, I think, is extremely important. It's also important to understand what is the history of surveillance technology. What is surveillance technology supposed to do? Surveillance technology at its best is used to find things that are broken, right? It might be used in infrastructure, it might be used to do all of these other types of things. Unfortunately, historically, surveillance technology has been used to identify people who the system thinks is broken, people who the system has identified as criminal. And that begins, you know, very early in the United States with slavery, right? And the lantern laws that were forced, slaves were forced, and Black people in this country were forced to walk around with lanterns so they can be identified. So it's to identify the other, it's to identify things that should not be a part of society. There's a number of books that I think are important. Simone Brown has a book called Dark Matters that I highly recommend. And when I stop talking, I'll put some of these in the chat. Ruha Benjamin has a book around race and technology. There's a magazine called Logic Magazine, which I think has a very good, it has a lens, an abolitionist lens. It's a lot of people of color who are involved in writing it, but also addressing all of these tech issues. And then clearly the work that Sarah is doing with her organization, I think is extremely important. Last thing is, if we don't have community, and I don't just mean a Muslim community, I don't mean a community in a mosque, I don't mean whatever. If we don't have a community, if we don't know who our neighbors are, if we don't know people who speak different languages, who are from different religions, people who we know and trust and actually have relationships with, it doesn't matter how much information you have, it doesn't matter how good the politicians are, we are not going to be able to resist the power, the wealth, and the money of some of these companies and politicians that are trying to exploit this technology in order to target us. People benefit from this technology. They're making money off of this technology. And so unless we have those kind of interpersonal connections with one another, unless we can call people and explain, hey, this isn't just important for me, it's also important for you, and I think Sister Linda Sarsour is a really good example of somebody in the Muslim community who recognizes that the struggles of other people who might not look like her, who might not speak like her, who might not be from New York, who might not be any of these types of things, that they have a right to be treated with human dignity in the same way that anybody else does. And if we're not standing up and building those relationships and advocating for those people, then when the ShotSpotters are targeting our community, the Muslim community, when smart streetlights are targeting our family members and people from our countries, we're going to be in trouble. So building those long-term relationships and connections with community members is absolutely necessary.
You want to go, Sarah?
Sure. So I threw a link in the chat for folks who want to get plugged in to the National Coalition or a local campaign. But I really want to talk a little bit about local campaigns for a second, because when people take on something like surveillance or like, technology or computational violence, like these feel like huge, because they are huge problems, right? But what folks often fail to realize is that they get embedded in very specific local contexts, right? So it's like 100 local contexts. It's not just surveillance or ShotSpotter. It's 100 local instances of city councils embedding ShotSpotter, right? So the local campaign is actually like the front of this fight. It's not as appealing as a national fight, of course, but that's how change happens, right? You convince 4 people, your city commissioners, to say no, right? And what's happening often is because we start looking at things like they're so big and we need to basically mobilize at that kind of a level, is that we're getting out organized at the local level, right? Like ShotSpotter vendors are speaking to our local council people because we're too busy trying to build out. And that level of out organizing is happening so quickly that these contracts are being embedded and ShotSpotter is making more and more procurements. Like one of the things that just flew under the radar is that in February, they bought CopLink X, which makes them the largest proprietary owner or the largest owner of proprietary law enforcement data in the world. In the country. Yeah. The largest owner of proprietary law enforcement data in the country, right? And so they just did this in the back end. I don't even think they put out a PR statement about it, right? And so if you're not watching and seeing how this company is moving in a way in which they're trying to court contracts at the very, very local level, we're gonna see this thing just explode into the country, and it's going to become too deep, too embedded, and importantly, local law enforcement are going to become too reliant on it. What it means when they purchase something like CopLink is that they're trying to do things like gun for local law enforcement intelligence interfaces. They're trying to provide other services, and if you're providing other services, you're effectively too big to fail in this space, right? So these local campaigns and these local coalitions are absolutely vital. And so I'm going to plug it again to just jump into that form. Give us your information, or don't give us your information, rather give the coalition information to connect to you if you want to start building with your local coalition and also on the national level.
I'll just, Khaled and Sarah did just such a wonderful job. I think for me, what I will say to folks is you got to connect the dots. What will happen is a lot of these for-profit companies, they will defend their practices. The police will always unequivocally defend their practices, defend their contracts. And the question that I would ask as a constituent, especially those of you who are kind of actively engaged in your communities, is when people claim this type of surveillance, the bloating of our police department budgets are the way to combat gun violence, I would like you to ask folks, where is their investment in the root causes of gun violence? I think oftentimes we are being sold that, and we are put in a predicament where if we oppose, police, or we oppose things like ShotSpotter, it means somehow that we don't care about addressing gun violence. Of course, the communities that are most directly impacted by gun violence care about ending gun violence. It is their children who are being murdered. It is their loved ones who are being murdered. It is their communities where they don't feel safe being able to be an elder going to a grocery store. So it's kind of, for me, oftentimes a bit offensive when activists, when Black and brown people are opposing these types of technologies, this type of violation of our civil liberties, that somehow we don't care about the actual issue. What we do know is that gun violence has root causes. Poverty is a root cause of gun violence, right? Lack of services and lack of mental health services are also part of root causes of things like gun violence. And so my question always is to my city council, it's always to my mayor, is to say, let me see what your investment is in tackling the root cause. Because even when you increase the police budgets of police departments and there is gun violence in our communities, the police only come after the gun's been shot, and oftentimes someone's already been wounded or someone's already been killed. Police do not prevent crime. Police come after the crime has already been committed. And so for me, I would encourage people to not, number one, get into local campaign, because this is all local. Yes, we could work on a federal level together, but that always is a long, long road, being able to work on this on a local level. But I will also say, ask the questions. What's the investment that our cities have when it comes to education, when it comes to jobs, when it comes to transportation and infrastructure, when it comes to mental health services, hospitals, and the many, many other services that our people need to thrive, not just to survive. You will find that in a place like New York City, if you add the budget of the New York City Department of Education, the Department of Mental Health, the Department of Health and Mental Health Services, the Department of Hospitals, the Department of Parks and Recreation, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Small Business, if you add all the budgets together, they are still smaller than the budget of the New York Police Department. And so for me, I always want my city budget to reflect our priorities, and our priorities should be the well-being of our people and not just more policing and more military equipment and more surveillance. It should be to ensure that we are lifting people up versus taking people from very dire situations and putting them into desperation that oftentimes is one of the causes of crime and high crime in the communities that we come from.
Great, thank you so much, Linda. So you already mentioned some of this in your remarks about how the proponents of technologies like ShotSpotter like to point to the fact that, you know, we oppose it, then we don't care about the gun violence epidemic and the rise in violence in our communities. I was curious if you all could maybe address that, because I'm sure folks on our calls will run into that from, you know, law enforcement officials or even some of their local elected officials saying, you know, all we're trying to do is do our best to decrease gun violence in our communities. So how would you counter proponents of ShotSpotter and other technologies that want to see a reduction in gun violence in our communities and or potentially, you know, pointing them towards a different alternative?
I'm going to start here quickly, just to say that there are proven alternatives. There are studies of alternatives to gun violence, alternatives to approaches to gun violence prevention. And that really is about investing in communities, investing in organizers, investing in violence interrupters, investing in programs for young people and youth in our community. We've seen that across the country, where violence interrupters, people who have the credibility and the relationships in our communities to help curb gun violence. The engagement, and, you know, elected officials always look at me like I'm out of my mind. We have a campaign with another organization that I work with called Until Freedom. We have a campaign called Boycott Black Murder. And one of the things we do as part of Boycott Black Murder campaign is you have to include gang members. You have to include former shooters, the formerly incarcerated. These are the people that have the credibility to share their experiences, right? To get people back on the right track, to help create that kind of dialogue that is actually going to get people to understand that, no, shooting is not cool. Gangsta life is not cool. Like, I can't have that conversation. That's not the conversation I'm going to be able to have. A city council member can't be able to talk to young folks that are part of gangs right now in our communities, or former gang members or gang leaders. That we got to bring all of our community together. And what we know from the investments across the country, even in New York City, the neighborhoods where New York City has invested millions of dollars in frontline organizers and gun violence prevention programs and violence interrupters are the communities with the least gun violence. And so what if we took those models that work, we've seen it work across the country, and say, let's double down on this investment. Let's triple down on this investment and actually build community, and at the same time curb gun violence. Again, there really isn't any study that shows that more police in our community is what keeps our community safe. We see plenty of communities across the country that don't have police at all. I mean, sometimes you have a small police department that got maybe 10, 15 cops in it. We don't see crime, but people don't say to themselves, wait a minute, why doesn't this community have crime and this community does? Well, this community is affluent. This community has high quality public education. This community has easy access to mental health services. This community has good paying job. This community allows communities to thrive. And so again, for me, when a city council member says, well, what if I don't vote for this? I'm going to be seen as someone who, doesn't care about the issue of the epidemic of gun violence. I would say to them, no, you have the opportunity to stand up and provide an alternative and say, maybe the answer is to invest in communities. Maybe the answer is to invest in frontline organizers. Maybe the alternative is to include people in a conversation that for you would be the unlikely people that you would ever sit down with. Maybe a politician never thought about sitting with a gang member or a gang leader or a former shooter or someone who's formerly incarcerated to really think about tell me your experience and explain to me what would have been the time for you to have gotten an intervention. What would that intervention have looked like in order for us to have stopped you from going into the path that you went from? Those are the stories we're not listening to. Those are the experiences that we're not factoring in to what those alternatives are.
I wanted to hop in real quick,
Absolutely.
if it's okay, totally, to look at this question from another angle. And I think this is the perfect community to do that in, which is to be really, really skeptical when the state tells you that there is a problem that they have identified, because 21 years ago, they identified terrorism as a problem. Right. And we saw what they did in response to that. What were the resources that they mobilized in response to that? Right. The wars that were levied in response to that. So that when the state identifies a problem, I don't mean when a community identifies a problem, I think that's very different. But when the state identifies a problem, that enrolls a whole host of actors and that enrolls a whole host of solutions that you're not going to want to address that problem, right? So pause whenever they're doing that and try and figure out why they're doing it that way, right? Because I think I recently read that like 1 in 8 children lost a caregiver through the COVID crisis or something like that, right? Like that is going to have tremendous effects on the level of violence that our communities experience. There are so many crises that we're living through right now, right? There's like heat waves in Northern California that's like affecting people, like all of these multiple crises. If the one that your city chooses to address right now is the gun violence crisis as they understand it, that means that they're like effectively not doing their jobs. They're not representing you or your needs. And I think you should really, really pause and refuse to accept these narratives, because what would have happened if the Muslim community also just accepted terrorism as the crisis that we needed to address at that time, right? What if we had just stood down and said, yes, we'll take that. That's what we need to be working on right now, right? It would have been devastating if folks didn't stand up against that.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So I want us to try to answer some of the questions in the chat. We've already answered a couple. So Jonas had a question about the program, and the question specifically is, isn't using devices like ShotSpotter moving policing away from the government sector to private sector, allowing them to decide what they want rather than following rules the government would have to follow? Do any of our panelists?
Can you read it again?
Sure. So the question that they're asking is, they're pointing to the fact that, programs like ShotSpotter, because it's a surveillance technology program operated by a private company, they're saying it's moving policing away from the government to private sector, and claiming that allowing them to decide what they want rather than following rules that the government would have to follow. I think I'm assuming they're implying that isn't that better, right? To get some private company to try to run this program as opposed to having more discriminatory or unconstitutional policies initiated by law enforcement.
If you don't mind me speaking back to back, I definitely can speak to this. Okay, perfect. So I think in an ideal sense, I think you said it was Eunice who asked that question. That makes a lot of sense. But the problem is that it's become extremely indistinguishable between what is a private law enforcement entity and what is a public law enforcement entity, because these like entities grow together, and they have historically for like 100 years now, right? Like, and how that happens is through these city contracts, because private entities are able to get like spaces where they can experiment, refine, and like make technology better that then they can go and spread elsewhere. There was one point at which like, I think something absurd, like 20% of ShotSpotter's revenue was coming from Chicago alone. That's your taxpayer dollars going to a private entity where it's like experimenting with and making this technology better. And then like you being able to sell it to like, you know, police departments all over the country. And so this like entanglement between the private and the public sector is really, really important. And like teasing out how grants are being allocated for law enforcement and also private entities to work together in a way that makes it so that both are effectively unregulated. One is not more regulated than the other. And these private entities are able to take advantage of like the low barrier to surveillance and privacy requirements that law enforcement have to get access to tons of data, tons of like, you know, of data of these constituencies, and then they're able to like innovate on and make tons and tons of money off of. So that lucrative exchange makes it so that it's effectively indistinguishable at this point.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. Anyone else want to answer that before we go to the next question?
I'll just quickly think, one of the things that strikes me when we're talking about surveillance technology, whether we're talking about surveillance by the government or whether we're talking about it by private entities, is how easily we're willing to and give up kind of our privacy rights and allow other entities to be able to track us, to be able to listen to us, to be able to follow us, to be able to do all of those things. I love my wife, and I think my wife loves me. And I love my family, and I have tons of friends and people who I'm close to, who I would trust with my life. I would never give them the technology to be able to track my every move, to be able to listen to every conversation, to be able to do all of these things. And so the idea that we're giving strangers, whether it's law enforcement or whether it's private companies, access to all of this very private, personal information for us is kind of mind-boggling. So I think we need to ask, look, if we're not okay with our wife or mom or brother or sister or best friend having access to this type of technologies, why in the world would we be okay with anybody else having it?
Great point, Khaled. So I'm going to see if we can answer Joanna's question next. So their question is specifically with respect to the organizing happening in Portland and San Diego. They wanted to know if the communications between ShotSpotter and police departments and the city has been made public in any way through FOIA request, specifically noting that it would be great to see how the company pitches itself to agencies. I mean, I can tell you that just based on just a number of articles I've seen, you know, there's been a ton of reporting done about the kind of the massive PR campaign that ShotSpotter has been running to make it more appealing to communities and law enforcement. But I'll turn it over to Sarah and Khaled to see if they have any insight on that.
Well, the Trust Coalition and some local journalism in San Diego has actually been doing a lot of important works, challenging particularly some of ShotSpotter's kind of statistics, and been able to see kind of how ShotSpotter gets their statistics that they sell to communities as effective from the law enforcement that's using them. So there's so many kind of problems that are happening there. There is a lot of journalism on this thing. Like, frankly, it's surprising to me that there's not, well, it's not surprising because we're dealing with money and power, that there's not more uproar over these technologies, because ShotSpotter in particular, their pitch and their claims aren't very attractive. Like, essentially, we tell the police whenever there's a loud noise. And why are we spending hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars on that? I don't know.
Sometimes when we get these like data jumps of communications, it's like kind of embarrassing because they're, you know, they're speaking to each other, but like what you ultimately walk away with understanding is that they're not saying anything that they're not saying in public, right? Just go on their website. They're absolutely transparent about how like terrible they are. They don't care. They're doing it because they don't care. And they've identified communities that they feel are in like dispensable and they can get away with exploiting, right? You can literally get this information off of their website.
Great, thank you so much,
Just
Sarah.
quickly, I just wanted to make a connection because this is geared towards a Muslim audience. I mean, it's the exact same thing we see overseas. You don't need to explain why you're invading Iraq. You don't need to explain why you're invading Afghanistan. The explanations and the legitimacy behind that is very kind of, you know, as a side note, the fact that these are Black and brown people who by default, according to the worldview that we've been raised in, don't know what's better for themselves. And as a result, for example, we need to send, you know, white men into a Black or brown country in order to save Black and brown communities from themselves is some of the craziest logic in the world. But that's exactly the same logic that's used with any type of support of law enforcement is let's take people from outside of the community. Let's not even deal with people. Let's take technologies from outside of the community and let's those people come up with the solutions. And then we enforce it with brutality and violence. And so I don't even remember what I was responding to, but so that's probably time for me to be quiet.
Thanks, Khaled. So we have about 1 more minute left. There's 2 questions. I'm going to roll them into one to see if our panel can take on. One of these questions came to us before the event today. The question is kind of broad, but what are some of the changes that the panelists and the movement against police surveillance want to see? And then another question that was typed in the chat by Ed is whether our panelists know anything about the other products that ShotSpotter is using and if they're using to criminalize Black, brown, and poor communities.
So
Sorry.
I'll go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, I was just pointing to other people.
Thank you, Khaled. I'll jump in here. I mean, I think the movement to against surveillance in America, number one, wants to see an end to unwarranted surveillance of our communities. Just bottom line, just stop it, end it. And one of the things that has really triggered me on this conversation just in the last 48 hours is that Miller, who was basically at the top of our counterintelligence program here in New York at the NYPD, who literally denied the existence of a Muslim surveillance program that everybody knew existed, including, our city officials, including people in the police department, including, reporters and investigators, is now been, he's moving on up, and now he's going to be the expert at CNN on law enforcement. I mean, these people get awarded, they get better jobs, they get to be now on camera, they become the propaganda machine for law enforcement, and they come from law enforcement, and now they're going to be on national television. For me, I think that I want to see more political leadership on this, as we saw in New York. And Tom Galati himself said this, and he was at the New York Police Department at the time, and he said it in a deposition in court. He said, we did not get one single lead from all the millions of dollars, the surveillance program, this mapping program that we had did not lead us to a single terrorist, right? Zero, Zippo, nobody terrorist. So that means that our taxpayer dollars were being wasted. And that is why it's important for all of us to kind of rise up, get into our kind of local community organizing groups and make sure that our cities are not wasting taxpayer dollars using unwarranted surveillance. And we have to remember that unwarranted surveillance is, of course, yes, impacting poor, brown, and Black communities, but it also impacts activists and organizers, specifically Black organizers who are being targeted by these types of surveillance programs. They are used as intimidation tactics. They are used to build files on organizers so that when they get into any interaction with law enforcement, whatever is in those files can be used against them. And so that's why, for me, I just want to see an end to surveillance. I want to see smart solutions. I want to see us defining safety in the way that communities define safety. Safety for people is being healthy. Safety for people is being able to have housing. Safety for me is being able to ensure that my children have the highest quality education. Safety is how I feel in my community amongst my neighbors. And so that's kind of the shift that we want to see: more accountability from our government, more transparency from our government, And I'd love to see FOIA requests across the country in police departments, because to the reporter's point, this is very important. They say one thing outside to the public at a press conference, but we know damn sure well if there's a FOIA, we watch those emails go back and forth. We know there's a different conversation that's happening, as we've seen with some of the revealed text messages about anti-Blackness and racism amongst police officers within certain departments across the country. So that's my hopes for our movements.
Great, thank you so much. Sarah, would you like to take that?
Yeah, absolutely. Building on that energy, I think this is especially important for the Muslim community because many of us are actually working in industries that have a direct hand in what this future can look like, right? Yesterday, we saw amazing organizing around the No Tech for Apartheid, which I know that this organization was a part of, that coalition, right? So like, for my tech, for the tech workers in the Ummah, right? You have a hand in what this future looks like, not just for your community, but for like other people, other communities targeted by this massive surveillance apparatus. So like connect with your fellow workers, connect with tech workers who are now refusing their labor to produce weapons that criminalize and enact violence on our communities here and our communities overseas.
I think one question that you had, Yasmine, that's really easy to look up, but the ShotSpotter people, which is a private corporation, they do everything. They have investigative tools, they do campus security, corporations can hire them. So you can find these things not just on, through law enforcement partnership, but your college campus could go hire ShotSpotter and put up these, these surveillance within your company that you work with, again, the school that you go to. So a very, very powerful and dangerous company all at the same time. So I hope that answers that question about what other tools do they have.
No, absolutely, very helpful. So we're at 4:04. I wanted to thank our panelists, be respectful of their time and also respectful of the time of our attendees. A number of the questions we unfortunately weren't able to get through, but a number of attendees have asked for us to follow up on additional resources, organizations they can connect with, including the organizations of our panelists, that they can continue the conversation and the work. And we'll be sure to also follow up with all the registered attendees in terms of all the resources that were shared by our team during the chat. I just want to also just turn it over to our panelists to see if they have any closing remarks, and wanted to just thank you all for joining us on this Friday afternoon.
I'm just going to say thank you so much, Sarah, for the work that you do. And especially this is kind of your thing. And I really appreciate knowing that there are people in our community who are like laser focused on the carceral kind of network and what we could do. So I appreciate you. And I know that we don't do that often in our movements. And Khaled, like, thank you for all the work that you do at Pillars of the Community. And just thank you for honoring us here with your presence.
Yeah, I'll add, thank you to MPower for MPower Change for the amazing work they're doing and for taking this on. Linda, of course, for your leadership on every single level. Those of you who haven't bought the book, buy her book. That book is a badass book. I teach it in my classes. People love it. It's an amazing book. It'll inspire you to action. It's not just a book to read and understand. And Sarah, of course, you do an amazing work. Again, having people like you who understand this tech is just such an enormous tool for the rest of us. And then lastly, big shout out to all my San Diego peeps, especially my Southeast San Diego peeps who joined the discussion today. This is really important work. And we're really behind, to Sarah's point earlier, when it comes to organizing against these things. And if we don't connect with other people who are like-minded and fight against these, the battles that are already difficult are only going to become increasingly challenging for all of us.
Great, thank you so much. Go ahead.
I have super little to add, just tremendous gratitude and like so honored to share space with you and learn from all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you to all of you for your immense work and to our attendees, and we'll be sure to follow up with you on next steps. Thanks again, everybody. Goodbye.
Peace. Assalamu alaikum.